Welcome back to Spartan Theology and this series I'm doing where I'm going through Dr. Chris Keats' book, Jesus Against Scribal Elite. This is the second video of the series. I'm going through chapter 1. Last video was just kind of an introduction to the series and just an introduction to the book in general. And this is where we're kind of getting to the meat of Dr. Keats' argument. So, like I mentioned in the last one, I want to say this at the beginning though. If you have questions or interesting comments, leave them down below. I didn't really get any on the first one, as obviously it was just an introduction, so that's fine. But like I said, if you have any interesting things, I'll address those at the beginning. Any questions or interesting comments I find underneath the video. So I'd appreciate it. Just leave a comment. Like I said, I'll address those at the start. I think that'll be an interesting way to kind of kick off each video, just kind of reflect on the last chapter by looking at any comments or whatnot. But I think that's really all we have to get started. I appreciate everybody watching. Could like and subscribe, like the video, subscribe to the channel. That definitely helps. But with that said, we can kind of get right into the argument. So to introduce this chapter, first I want to just start off by saying all the Gospels affirm that those around Jesus recognized him as both a rabbi and a teacher. And this is really not a controversial claim. It's accepted by pretty much all scholars on the subject. And as Keith points out, that calling Jesus a rabbi and a teacher does not offer much specificity, though, about his pedagogical identity, beyond the fact that Jesus garnered these titles. So by this, Keith is pointing out that these terms did not have the formal meaning that the term rabbi would come to have post 70 CE. In Jesus' time, these were much more unofficial titles. Keith also makes note of the fact that, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, the term rabbi mainly carries a negative connotation, and the term teacher is used exclusively to refer to Jesus. And in Mark, Judas calls Jesus rabbi at the moment of betrayal, but unlike Matthew, Mark has Peter call Jesus rabbi, so it's kind of both a good and bad term. And then Luke avoids the term rabbi altogether, and John refers to Jesus as both teacher and rabbi, so he uses both pretty much, both the same way. And therefore, neither the historical context nor the literary uses of the specific titles of rabbi or teacher for Jesus really clarify much about the precise type of rabbi or teacher that Jesus was, or that he was perceived to be by the gospel authors. And so in the next part, losing track of where I'm at. Let me move the slide. So in the next part, Keith goes on to explains a bit about what other scholars, how they've tried to address this question. So of what type of teacher was Jesus? So some scholars compare him to contemporary figures, and then some scholars study the style and content of Jesus' teaching to identify him, and then others attempt to attribute the correct labels such as wisdom teacher, apocalyptic prophet, etc. to Jesus. But Keith takes a different approach that is much more fundamental. He argues that there is a strict class divided between the literate scribal class that can access the holy text for themselves and those who rely on that class to access the text for them. So Keith is asking in this book, was Jesus the type of Jewish teacher who held scribal literacy? And this is on page 36 where he knows that. And so then he goes on to say that in 1989, William Harris published his work titled Ancient Literacy. And this led to a major shift in academic thinking on the topic of literacy in the ancient Hellenistic and Roman empires. And this also led to a lot of new research on the topic. So in this book, Dr. Keith takes six aspects and how they were important to understanding how the Gospels portrayed Jesus. These six aspects, that's hard to say, are major illiteracy, degrees of literacy, reading and writing as separate skills, multilingualism, Scribal Literacy and the Social Perception of Literacy. So, and we'll go on to kind of break down each one of these 6, and that'll be the meat of this chapter. So first off, we got major illiteracy. And in the book I mentioned before, which is William Harris's book, or William Harris, maybe saying that. Yeah, William Harris. I don't know why I got a brain fart. But yeah, William Harris's book, he argues that the likely literacy level of the ancient Roman Empire was around 90%. And this widespread illiteracy is also supported by Origen in his defense of Christianity against the critic Celsus. But then, after Harris's book was published, Catherine, and this book had a huge effect. This book specifically, this William Harris's book. And but after Harris's book was published, Catherine Hezer published her book, Jewish Literacy in Roman Palestine, and as you can see by the title of this book, it's much more specific and really relevant exactly to the argument that Keith is making in this book. And she argues alongside Harris that literacy was very low in Jesus' context, and she also makes note that there was nothing like a formal elementary education system that happened in the synagogues or anything like that. And but she actually claims that illiteracy was likely closer to 3% and not the 10% that Harris was arguing. So even still lower. And so yeah, this really came to lead to the rejection of a lot of the assumptions around early education that a lot of scholars took in regards to Jesus' time and place and historical context, that there just weren't these early education. So what about this topic specifically, though, how large illiteracy was at the time? What does this tell us, and what does this not tell us? All this research that we've been talking about. So for one, what it doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us that Jews at this time did not receive instruction and teaching about the Torah and their history. They still learn these things, and to learn these, you didn't necessarily have to know how to read the text for yourself, or especially not know how to write. You just could learn from other people, and that doesn't mean you had no clue what it said. You could be very educated on the topic of what your holy text says, but you can't access it for yourself. And two, a major thing that this doesn't tell us is that no one learned to read and write in the synagogue. This is much too strong of a claim that some people kind of went on to say, but that's not supported by the evidence. You can't say that there were no types of education systems in synagogues. It just wasn't a widespread, commonplace thing that a lot of people partook in. But what does this tell us? This does tell us that anyone who did receive a literate education early in life, or really at all in the synagogue, they were in a very stark minority. And two, while the majority of Second Temple Jews learned about their holy text, only a select few could access the text for themselves, like I just mentioned just a second ago. So, lastly, on this point, though, I want to pull up a super important footnote I found in the book. And as you can see here, it's kind of a lot. And I'm not expecting people to kind of read this so fast or anything. It's just a list mainly of different important scholarly books on the topic. But you can see a lot of really important names and really popular books, and really like 2004, 2001, like pretty recent works. And all these works here argue that Jesus did go to some sort of like elementary school type education system in the synagogue, which, as we just saw by Harris and Hezer's work, this just wasn't really a common thing. So Jesus would have to been something special to do this, and that's really not what they're arguing. They're arguing, he just kind of went to the regular old elementary school, and that, like I said, just wasn't really the case at the time. So next point, and that was like the majority illiteracy was one of the larger points in this category, but he just wanted to note that literacy shouldn't be thought of as like an on and off category. It's really came in degrees. So some people learned a little bit, some people learned a lot. And typically, just a big point in this is typically people only learned really what was necessary to their position in life. So if you were like a merchant, you would learn how to write a receipt or something or sign your name, but that didn't mean you could read and write like we think of today. So just to make note, like even if someone did get a little bit of an education, they probably weren't learning more than they needed. And I think there was nothing on this specific one. So next, separate literate skills of reading and writing. So we think a lot today that reading and writing just kind of go hand in hand, but this really wasn't the case in Jesus's context. And the skill and but another important thing here to note is that to be a scribal authority, so to be someone who really had authority and could tell someone what the text says, you had to be able to read, but you also had to be able to write, which would mean you were a even more select minority. That's like the big point here. Not only would there might have been 3 to 10%, wherever you go, that knew how to read, but less of that would be able to write. And to be able to write was required to be a scriptural authority. And then some people will argue that the widespread awareness, uses, and dedication to text in the Second Temple period implies higher literacy rates. So like how, for example, kind of like how Jesus just quotes the text of the Old Testament or something, and for people to catch that, you would think, oh, they must be able to read, if they're going to ever catch these things he's saying or the way people, and that just wasn't the case at all. Because like I said, I've mentioned a couple of times now, you could be very familiar with what the text says, but not have access to it yourself. You just learned from a teacher and going to synagogue how often as they did. They would be very familiar with the text, just like, we're familiar with so many cultural things that maybe movies and books and stuff that we haven't even read or seen for ourselves. It's sort of part of the culture and part of the air. So, like I said, just this widespread usage and stuff doesn't necessarily imply a higher literacy rate than we mentioned before. Next, multilingualism. So this is just to make a point that just because you're literate in one language doesn't mean you're literate in all, and that's kind of common sense, but just something to really think about. And at the time, the common language for the Jews would have been Aramaic or Greek, because that was what was being spoken, and biblical Hebrew would be a much more select group. So just because maybe you learned how to read and write for your job or whatever you did, where you worked in the market or something, you had contact with different people where reading and writing would be useful, doesn't mean you could read and write, or you had authority over the Hebrew Bible. That would take, biblical Hebrew, which, like I said, is a much smaller group and much more specific. You'd have to get a specific education that would lead to that. So that's all I really wanted to note about this multilingualism. And then scribal literacy. So just to note here that scribal literacy, and we've kind of said this already a few times, but it required more than, but one thing to really make note of is that it required more than just being able to read and write. Even being able to read and write in biblical Hebrew, one wouldn't necessarily be considered a scribal authority. It would really require elevated social status as well. So people have to respect you, and you would come up in the ranks or something. You wouldn't just walk into town, I know how to read and write, and you're automatically an authority on the text. It didn't really work that way at the time. Like I said, you'd have to be a part of this sort of smaller social class. And then a social perception of illiteracy. So there are certain activities that someone does that clearly distinguish their social class, be it reading in the temple or something along those lines. But also to make, just so, like I said, obviously if you're doing some of these things, if you're reading and writing biblical Hebrew, you're probably a part of this specific social class, or, you're not a peasant or whatnot. Peasant isn't the right word, but so that's kind of anachronistic, but I think you kind of catch what I'm getting at. And it's something to make note of, though, if someone was partaking in like teaching with authority, like Jesus is said to be doing in the Gospels, it would be a fair assumption and justified assumption that one could mistake him or just assume that he's like, if someone wasn't familiar with who was a part of the scribal elite class and who wasn't, if you saw someone teaching like Jesus is portrayed as doing, it would be a safe assumption to say he was a part of this class. And like I said, to be a part of that class, one would have to be able to read and write. So that'll make more sense, kind of what I'm getting at as we get later and more specific. I don't want to just throw in random points where, but just to say, it would be easy for someone to mistake what skills someone had simply by seeing them as being a part of a different class, if that makes sense. And like I said, this is a big point that he'll get into later in the book. That'll make a lot more sense. But kind of just to end it off, and I know this is covering me up a little bit, but just to end it off, I wanted to read the very last paragraph of this chapter as he kind of sums things up better than I could. So, of course, such boundaries between scribal literate authorities and scribal illiterate manual laborers were products of social roles and expectations, not physical barriers. A member of the manual labor class could have theoretically participated in some activities associated with the teachers who could read scripture for themselves, such as expounding the text. In light of the available sources, such an occurrence would certainly have been atypical but not impossible. According to Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel, that is precisely what Jesus of Nazareth, the Galilean teacher, did. Luke's Gospel, however, has a different take on what happened when Jesus taught in a synagogue. This intra-gospel disagreement is a topic of chapter 2. So this kind of like makes a little bit of a point, and like I said, we'll get in this in chapter 2, but just how seeing Jesus do certain things might have led people to think which class he was a part of and whether or not he was a part of one of the literate classes. So, boom, just to end things off a little bit, I hope you kind of enjoyed that. It was pretty quick. I went through those, I know, quick, but if you have questions or anything, I think this chapter really spells out well, though, what kind of teachers there were. That's what we're getting at here, and what it meant to be a teacher, what it meant to have authority, what it meant to be literate, what kind of people would be literate. So I hope you kind of got a little bit of that. I definitely recommend reading the book alongside, because I'm not going into super fine detail. Like I said, I want to keep these videos around 20 minutes if possible, and this seems to be kind of right on the mark, a little under. So yeah, so if you watch this all the way through, I really appreciate you definitely watching it all the way through. That helps my videos a lot. The best way to help me too is to like the video, like I said at the beginning, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Like I said, I'll address any comments I get in the next video. I think that'll be a fun way to go about it. And yeah, I hope you're enjoying this. There'll be other videos on my channel you can check out too. This won't be the only thing, but I'm trying to keep these to one a week, and it seems really, really easy to kind of do one a week. That's not a burden on me. So I appreciate you watching. Like I said, I don't want to ramble on here at the end, but everybody have a great day.